Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk about argument assessment. Argument assessment is an important skill for you to learn as you go through your collegiate, professional, and normal life. It will allow you to better understand arguments that people give you and better understand ways to respond to them. So starting off with argument assessment, one of the things that we're checking for is how persuasive an argument is. An argument could be a very good inductive argument, maybe very inductively forceful, but not be very persuasive. For example, say you have a coin and you flip the coin and you say, this coin is going to land on heads. It can be inductively true that the coin is going to land on heads, but it's not a very persuasive argument. It's the case that just because you say it's going to land on heads doesn't guarantee it's going to land on heads. It doesn't necessitate the coin landing on heads. Additionally, when it comes to arguments that people present to you, there's no guarantee that they will be persuasive to you, even though the arguments are inductively forceful or even in some cases deductively valid and sound. Persuasiveness in an argument is something that differs from individual to individual. It could be the case that you hear an argument and don't find it very persuasive, but that your neighbor hears it and does find it very persuasive. We see this a lot with politics. People can hear something similarly and feel completely different about it, such as raising taxes. One person can hear raising taxes and think, oh, well, that's good. It's going to put more money for healthcare, for schools, yada, yada. But then another person might hear and say, oh, well, raising taxes, that's not so good. That's taking money out of my pocket. It's not allowing me to do the things that I want to do. So as I said, persuasiveness deals with why ought you accept this argument. So for example, let's think about Napoleon's battle at Waterloo. Obviously, us with hindsight, looking at whether or not he should have a battle at Waterloo, we know that that's going to lead to his downfall. But at the time, Napoleon probably saw very good and persuasive reasons to have this battle at Waterloo. When it comes to persuasiveness, it's not all or nothing. An argument can be more or less persuasive. For example, an argument for or against evolutionary ethics could seem very persuasive to you, or it could not. It could seem only slightly persuasive to you. Arguments might persuade one person but not another. Many times the persuasiveness of an argument will come from the authority of a speaker. So for example, your buddy down the street tells you that you should eat more vegetables. You might brush it off and say it's not important, whereas if your medical doctor tells you you need to eat more vegetables, then you might find it much more persuasive due to the authority that the medical doctor carries with them. For an argument to be persuasive, it must be justified. And we talked a little bit in previous lectures about justified true beliefs. Justified meaning that you have a reason to believe it. You have a reason to believe that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. You have a reason to believe it's going to rain. You have a reason to believe that if you let go of something, it will fall to the ground, right? So justification just means that you have a reason to believe, a logical, sound reason why you should believe this thing. One way that we can deal with this question of persuasiveness is through argument assessment. Argument assessment is one of those tools that we can use as thinkers to help us determine whether or not an argument is persuasive, to help us determine if the argument is valid, sound, inductively forceful, cogent, so on and so forth, right? We do that through a few different methods. The most common are using counterexamples. So if someone says that all swans are white, your counterexample would be that you found a swan that was black. Another way that you might try and assess an argument is by proving some of the premises wrong. So if they say, Coca-Cola is good for you, therefore I should drink more Coca-Cola, you might go through and find an article by a doctor saying that sugary sodas are not good for you, right? You proved the premise false. But when you're in the process of assessing an argument, you want to avoid labeling and who's to say problems. So starting with labeling, that's when you basically do an ad hominem attack on the argument itself. So if someone says we should raise taxes to better support schools, labeling would be something to the effect of, that's what all you liberals say, that we should raise taxes. I don't believe in that. You didn't actually deal with the argument, you just insulted the argument or insulted the speaker by applying a certain label to it. The who's to say problem comes down to something like this. Say someone tells you that if the factory in town closes, then domestic violence rates will rise. Who's to say would be basically attacking part of the argument, saying, well, who's to say that domestic violence rates will rise? You didn't really attack the linkage between the factory closing and domestic violence rates. You attacked the authority of the person making the assessment. You're attacking the statistics or the methods rather than the argument itself. Now, after you've finished assessing an argument, the final thing you need to do is write up a commentary in plain English explaining all the things you've done with the argument. You want to explain any rhetoric that you diffused. You want to explain any implicit premises that you brought about, and you want to explain any conclusions that were arrived to. You want to explain whether the argument was persuasive, whether it was forceful, whether it was valid, sound, so on and so forth. And you want to do it in pretty excruciating detail. That way you make the reasoning very clear at every step of the way. So now I'm going to give you a quick example of how to do an argument assessment. And I'm not going to write it out. You can see my whiteboard's pretty small, but I will kind of talk through what my commentary would be if I did write it out. The argument we're going to assess is a pretty simple one. So let's go through it and see how it works. The argument is, if Zach is from Kentucky, then Zach is a hillbilly. So KY, then H. Therefore, Zach loves fried chicken. So we've got, if you're from Kentucky, then you're a hillbilly and you love fried chicken. So with the assessment, let's start off with removing any rhetoric, right? I would go so far as saying that hillbilly is probably some rhetoric that, is kind of insulting to a speaker or to a listener. I don't think it furthers the argument. So what's the idea that they're trying to get across? A hillbilly is like a country person. They tend to live a more rural lifestyle. So let's redefine hillbilly as H equals country person. All right. So our first step is KY, then country person. All right. Now, how do we go from being a country person to loving fried chicken? Well, I believe there's an implicit premise. So let's bring out that implicit premise. The implicit premise is, if you are a country person, then you love fried chicken. All right. So when we get to our conclusion, we can restate it in such a way such that if you're from Kentucky, then you love fried chicken. So you see what's happened here. We've changed hillbilly to country person. We've brought out an implicit premise, right? That way we know this wasn't in the original argument. And then we clarified it. So the way it stands now, it's actually in the form of a hypothetical syllogism. If you're from Kentucky, then you're a country person. If you're a country person, then you love fried chicken. Therefore, if you're from Kentucky, you love fried chicken. So you can see here, we've done something to the argument. We've made some changes. So let's get into the assessment stage. First thing we'd do is list out what we had done. In doing this argument, we 1, removed rhetoric. Then 2, we outlined a implicit premise. And then 3, we restated the conclusion. Now, in doing this, You know, the idea of love and fried chicken and Kentucky therefore fried chicken are slightly different ideas, but they're not so different that it completely changes the purpose of the argument, right? So when we look at it, what the arguer is trying to say in their original statement was that hillbillies love fried chicken. And when we look at the new statement, we've clarified it. We've actually made their argument a little bit stronger, because by putting their argument in the form of a hypothetical syllogism, then assuming that these two premises are true, then there's no way that this can be false, right? Now, as far as assessment, let's get into the assessment phase. Is this argument persuasive? Maybe. The problem is this argument can easily be attacked by showing that either one of these premises are false. Is it the case that people from Kentucky are country people? Maybe, but what about someone who lives in Lexington or Louisville? Those are pretty good-sized cities. I would be hard-pressed to think that someone from a good-sized city is a country person. Now, this argument was about Zach being a country person. So is it the case that Zach is a country person? Well, maybe. He was born in a rural part of Kentucky, but the idea of being a country person, I think, implies a little bit more than that, right? The hillbilly term described here isn't just about where a person is born, it's about a certain lifestyle they live. So does he live that lifestyle? Who knows, right? Then the next one, country people love fried chicken. That's the implicit premise, but it's very likely the case that we could go into the depths of the hills and find the most hillbilly person in the world, and there's a possibility that this person might not like fried chicken. So therefore, it's not a very great argument, right? It's not very persuasive. We don't have strong reason to believe it. We can see that the argument itself is stronger now than it was before, but it's not a very great argument. With all that being said, I hope this has been helpful to you in learning about persuasiveness and argument assessment. Like I said, this was a very simple example, but if you're one of the students in my class, you got the textbook, you can do some practice examples out of that. If you're someone on YouTube just watching this, a random person, you can just find an article about some topic, say a political topic, and see if it's very persuasive to you. If you've made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate you taking the time to study with me, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.